Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Know and Tell, being a mandated reporter in New Hampshire. This webinar is part of our 2018 Student Wellness Webinar Series. My name is Kelly Lenti, and I'm the Communications Coordinator in the Office of Student Wellness here at the New Hampshire Department of Education. And for those of you not familiar with the Office of Student Wellness, we are located right here in Concord, and in addition to administering several large grant programs, we strive to provide strong, evidence-based professional development opportunities to New Hampshire educators and those working with our state's children, youth, and families. More information about our office can be found on our website, www.nhstudentwellness.org. Some logistics for this afternoon's webinar. We encourage you to mute your telephone line or microphone to limit background noise. And if you would like to voice your comment, please raise your hand in the participant box or use the chat box, which you can find by hovering your mouse at the bottom of your screen. We will also be answering questions from the chat box at the end of the presentation. A recording of this webinar and its slides will be emailed out within the next week, and they will also be posted on our website. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers for today, Megan Oliviero and Stephanie Arroyo.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for that really lovely introduction. This is Megan Oliviero here. I am the Director of Education and Outreach here at the Granite State Children's Alliance, which is the chapter organization for New Hampshire's Child Advocacy Centers. As part of the work of the chapter organization, we also operate 4 child advocacy centers throughout the state of New Hampshire, and those are located in, there are 2 in Hillsborough County, Nashua and Manchester, and then we have one up in Belknap County, and then one over in the Monadnock region located in Keene. I just want to take the opportunity to thank Kelly and thank the Office of Student Wellness for providing this opportunity. We have an initiative called Know and Tell, which is an surrounded around mandated reporting and all adults in New Hampshire being mandated by law to report child abuse when it's suspected. So Know and Tell is the responsibility of all New Hampshire adults to know the signs of child abuse and tell responsible authorities when they recognize them. I also have Stephanie Arroyo with me. She is our new education coordinator and training specialist. She came on board January 2nd. As a full-time training specialist to really take Know and Tell to scale in New Hampshire so that we're able to offer in-person Know and Tell workshops to school districts, youth-serving organizations, and really any group or organization that works with children. This is a 1-hour webinar. We typically provide this material in at least a 90-minute in-person presentation, so I apologize for what may feel like throwing a lot of information at you. But in order to get through all of the information, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I do apologize in advance for that. And I encourage you to attend May 7th. Some of the information will overlap with what we're covering here, but we will also have time to do some activities, in-person activities that really will drive home some of the components and dynamics of child abuse that will help us all in our role protecting children from predators. Just the housekeeping quickly, just please go ahead and, as a reminder, use your chat button if you have any questions throughout the process. Again, we are, have limited time here. So today our topics are, we're going to dive into the signs of child abuse. How do we know it's child abuse? We're going to talk about any barriers that we might experience in reporting what we suspect is child abuse. We're going to talk about and review how to respond if a child were to disclose to us or come to us with an outcry of abuse, whether that's sexual abuse or physical abuse or extreme neglect. We're also going to talk about what does that mean when we are in that role, and how do we tell DCYF or law enforcement about what we have just learned or what we suspect is happening to a child. All of those bullets, those 4 bullets, are incredibly important because we at Child Advocacy Centers do not have the ability to help children unless people report child abuse. We do not see children at a Child Advocacy Center unless someone has reported that child abuse or suspected child abuse to law enforcement or DCYF. That's how we receive our referrals. I'll talk about that a little bit later on in more detail. So today we're going to gain some knowledge about child abuse, in particular child sexual abuse. We're going to understand some of those dynamics a little bit more. We will hopefully at the end of this hour have some tangible steps that we can take if we suspect abuse. We're also going to understand the Child Advocacy Center and how that helps children and families in this regard. And then how do we intervene? What can we do for intervention? There are opportunities for intervention around us all the time, and what we do with that is our responsibility as a caring adult. So what do we need to know? What are some signs of child abuse? This is a question that I think we often, if we could also just sort of listen to our gut a little bit, we could probably find an answer. This next slide will give you a more legal definition of what sexual abuse is. It's really any, and some of this material can be upsetting, and I apologize for that, but it is the reality that some of these children face on a daily basis. It's really any act that would occur between two adults is occurring between an adult and a child. The major difference here is, of course, an adult has an automatic power differential there. So oftentimes we get a lot of questions about, adolescents who may be sexually abusing younger children. And that, again, there's that power differential there, whether it's size or age. Things that are also really important to keep in mind are, in this day and age, things that include either, cell phones or Snapchat or, images that might be sent back and forth. That also is considered sexual abuse and is definitely a red flag. Some other red flags that are really important, and I don't know what age groups the people on the webinar work with. And some of these red flags will vary depending on those age groups, but some of them will definitely stay the same. Changes in sleep pattern are certainly something that will occur across the developmental spectrum. Academic performance is also something that would occur kind of across the developmental spectrum. Anger and mood swings, sexually inappropriate behavior, changes in appetite. Some of the things that are more for littler kids, either preschool aged or even elementary school aged, are some things like bedwetting. Those fears and phobias also kind of go across the age spectrum. Just to give you an example of, for example, if a child is, let's say an 8-year-old who is functioning very well in school, either second grade or third grade, and then suddenly starts having some fears and some bedwetting, and maybe is going to the nurse a lot with a tummy ache, and is just not quite, just a couple of these things kind of pop up seemingly out of the blue. And I say that because it's, of course, not actually out of the blue, but seemingly out of the blue. That to me represents what I will call an opportunity for intervention. That's an opportunity for a teacher or somebody who's paying attention, a guidance counselor, any person, any adult, to go ahead and ask some of those tough questions like, hey, how are you doing? I mean, of course, you would do this as a caring adult, and we can talk more about kind of getting an answer we might not expect later on, but really be that adult that intervenes in that child's life at that time, just to say, hey, I've noticed you're experiencing some belly aches, and I know you're having trouble sleeping at night, and I noticed you're not doing so well on your school exams anymore. Can you tell me what you think's going on? Children really appreciate it when adults notice them. And we want that to be for good reasons, but often it's because something else might be going on. Again, all of these things could be something very benign, meaning maybe mom and dad have not been getting along. And so the child is incredibly anxious because she or he is worried about their mom and dad getting a divorce. Stress can cause a lot of these things. But it also may be something else going on. One other thing to note on this red flag behavior is the sexually inappropriate behavior flag. Again, this is something that's a little bit more for middle school or younger age kiddos. When we see a child who is acting on the playground or with their peers in a way that just sort of screams, holy cow, this kid knows way too much about what their sexual body parts are for, then that's a large red flag right there. And that could include anything from, we have seen cases in the Child Advocacy Center where a child has been exhibiting sexually inappropriate behavior with their peers at school. And when they come into the Child Advocacy Center, they talk about where they learned that. And again, it could be because maybe at home they watch pornography, or maybe at home someone is coming into the child's room at night. The reasons may vary, but it's our job as adults to go ahead and not ignore that inappropriate behavior and to get some more information about where that might be coming from. Behaviors are, of course, a form of communication. Children communicate with us in all sorts of different ways, and behavior is certainly one of them. And when the topic is so difficult as sexual abuse or feeling unsure because something is happening to them and they don't know what to do with it, they often can engage in behaviors that are quite alarming. And these are some of those behaviors. Again, these are things that you may or may not have the ability to be aware of in your capacity in the school system, as far as, but I don't know if there are nurses on the webinar or anything like that, but certainly I know some school nurses that have had to deal with this kind of behavior. Again, this is sexually inappropriate behavior. A little girl or a little boy understands, depending on their relationship at home with parents and what kind of things they talk about, but may understand that they have a vagina, or may understand that they have body parts that have holes, but they don't really fully understand what those body parts are for. And they certainly shouldn't understand, again, depending on age and relationships with parents and conversations, that objects go in there, or that they're used in that way for sex and for gratification. So who is at risk of abuse? It's really important that we all understand that children of every gender, age, race, ethnicity, background, socioeconomic status is at risk for child sexual abuse. There is no greater example of that than what we witnessed, I think, with the gymnastics team. And when we look at the broad spectrum of girls who were sexually abused by Larry Nasser, that kind of puts that into sort of stark reality, that no child is immune. There are some additional risk factors, though, that we have to be aware of. And a lot of these additional risk factors scream vulnerability. And so, yes, we call them risk factors, but they really are what make a child vulnerable to someone who could easily manipulate the situation to their own end. And that is a lower socioeconomic status. They may experience a disability and require additional adults in their life to help with daily care. Rural areas, because there are typically less eyes, less ears, less services. Children who witness other crimes, just this is an example of just some instability in the child's life. And then parents who are not necessarily in the workforce also create an additional risk factor for a variety of reasons. And I think if anyone really looking at this slide could also see how a lot of these are all interrelated. They don't stand alone. This is important for us to know on the startling statistics slide that these are the most recent information that we have. I hesitate sometimes using statistics because sometimes I think we get a little kind of boggled up with the numbers because we just say to ourselves, well, this can't possibly be true that 1 in 10 children are sexually abused before the age of 18. If that's true, if I look at my classroom, then that means X number of kids are experiencing sexual abuse. This is a statistic, 1 in 10, that has held true for almost 30 years, as long as they have been researching and tracking this information. The numbers vary a little bit, 1 in 4 and 1 in 6. Like 20 years ago, it was 1 in 10 boys, but the 1 in 4 girls has pretty much stayed consistent. And again, if you look below on the sexually solicited while on the internet, that's included in that 1 in 10 of children. So there are multiple ways that our children are experiencing things that are considered abuse. The 70% of all reported sexual assaults occur to children ages 17 and under. That is from the FBI crime statistics. That is also, sadly, a statistic that is generally held over time, as long as they've been tracking that information. And again, that's from the FBI. That is not local New Hampshire information. But it does, when we look at our NCA statistics and our reporting that we have to do, it's pretty close. It's just about 70%. The 50% is a New Hampshire statistic. That was something that we discovered when we did some looking at our numbers of the children that we serve here at New Hampshire Child Advocacy Centers. 50% of the children that we serve are under the age of 12. So if we just think about, again, our classrooms, our schools, our communities, what that means. As far as who are these people that are doing this to children? And again, these vary, but the generality pretty much stays the same, that about 90% of children are sexually abused by someone either in the child's family somehow or known to the child's family. Somebody who is a trusted adult, good friend, family member, coach. About 10% of children in New Hampshire are abused by a stranger, someone that they don't know or don't have a pre-existing relationship with. It's important also when we think about this that we realize that the individuals that perpetrate these crimes really manipulate the entire family structure. It is not just a manipulation of the child, it's a manipulation of the family and often the entire community. Again, I just going back to the gymnastics case and what Dr. Larry Nasser did, he not only manipulated the girls and the families, but he manipulated entire systems all the way up to the college that employed him. So who are child sex offenders? Who are these people? This slide is kind of a joke. You know, we like to talk to our kids about the scary people that lurk in bathrooms, and the reality is that is a very small number of people. Yes, it is true that this happens sometimes, but for our role here and for what we're trying to have a better understanding on, are the other 90%. The other 90% of people who offend against children are not this guy. The other 90% of people who perpetrate crimes against children find a way to legitimize their contact with children and families. They do that by obtaining employment or a volunteer job or some other way that they become either the friendly neighbor or the friendly coach or the really nice guy or and I apologize for keep saying guy, but we also know statistically that majority of people who perpetrate these crimes are male. they will create opportunities to gain access, often prolonged access to children. And often they are very deliberate about how they do that. This is a little bit more about sort of who these people are. The part of this that is incredibly alarming to me is that we have this idea, this myth, that people who perpetrate sexual crimes against children are either gay or they're a pedophile. And the reality is that the majority of them are heterosexual males. They would categorize themselves as a heterosexual male. They may be married, they may have a girlfriend, but what is important here is that they are able, through their systematic manipulation, to abuse at least an average of 117 victims before they are ever brought to justice or stopped. Again, the gymnastics example is clear evidence of a person who is able to do this. Excuse me, I need to get some water here. Most of the abuse will often occur either in the child's home or in the offender's home, or in car rides to and from either of those locations. It is one of those things that one of those barriers that we really have to kind of get around in our own heads, that we have this sort of stereotypical idea of who these people are. And we have to realize that they are regular people, often with families, and they are in our community, and that we have to kind of own that if we're gonna do the right thing for kids. So we have also to think about our responsibility as adults to protect children from offenders. This is the recent case in California, where the children were discovered in their, one of the children escaped in order to get help for her siblings. And the responsibility of some people who lived around this home. I don't know anyone else who was observing this as it unfolded, but those houses certainly looked really close together. And there were so many children living in there that it just seemed to me that there were some opportunities for intervention. What's that? Oh, thank you, Stephanie. That, there were some of those reports from neighbors who just said, the kids looked scared to death, or it was weird that they were out in the middle of the night doing yard work, or couldn't believe how malnourished they were when they were taking down the Christmas decorations in the middle of the night. Those are examples truly of a time when that pure suspicion, at least in New Hampshire law states that if you suspect abuse, you must report it. So that mere suspicion that there was something awry in this home in New Hampshire rises to the level of making a report to DCYF or law enforcement. It breaks my heart that 17-year-old girl escaping out of her home was the first time that law enforcement was ever alerted to something that was amiss in this situation. Another case that very clearly highlights adult responsibility in keeping kids safe, and how it failed hundreds, if not thousands, of children, was the John Gagan case, which really was the tipping point in the child sexual abuse scandal that rocked the Catholic Church. And you could really look at that picture of Cardinal Law, and you could say that he is probably John Gagan and all those priests are, of course, responsible for the heinous acts that they did and what they did to those children. But Cardinal Law really certainly holds responsibility as well for failing to do anything about it, failing to protect those children in any way. Oftentimes, adults fail to report what they know or suspect about a child that may be being abused, but then there's also attempts to even cover up what might be happening. This, of course, is Jerry Sandusky, and Penn State, of course, has had to literally pay millions of dollars to make right what they did wrong. They've also had to, whoops, I'm gonna go back, I'm sorry. They also had to, there were individuals who had to, who were criminally prosecuted for failing to report the abuse that was witnessed there. And then we have not only the cover-up that might be involved, but we have some bystanders. Again, these are just some examples from what ended up recently in the news with Larry Nasser. We have not only the person, Larry Nasser, is ultimately responsible for what he did and how he manipulated the girls and the families, but also Michigan State. She had, was forced to resign over her handling or mishandling of the scandal and the reports of abuse. But you also have all the way up to the entire USA Gymnastics Board of Directors needing to resign. This again goes back to Penn State, and that is Joe Paterno. And the other individuals in the photograph are the athletic director and the president of Penn State. The athletic director and the president both were criminally brought to justice and had to pay fee and spend some time in jail for their failure to report the child abuse that they witnessed or that they knew about. So again, this is a lot of information all at once, and it's important to talk sort of about how did those people get away with what they did and for how long. And it's important to understand a process called grooming, which is a process that perpetrators of child abuse engage with children and families, that they will, that they will engage in an intentional process to manipulate the child. They are very deliberate about it. They are very selective. It often begins with kind of finding that vulnerability that we talked about before, either one of those additional risk factors or some kind of vulnerability that the child may have, and then it is used to engage in that grooming process. For those of you that will be able to join us for the in-person presentation on May 7th, we are going to have enough time to do an activity that really highlights the grooming process and the power dynamic that exists within this relationship, because it is absolutely 100% a relationship that is created, and it's either created through an opportunity in a coaching situation, a single mom situation, a confused teenager needs an adult role model situation. A person who is going to engage in this is very particular about how they go about it. And they will often select a person, and really the grooming process starts with boundary issues. They will kind of start pushing those boundaries. And it may be the child's boundaries, it may be the family's boundaries, but they'll start poking holes in some of those boundaries to see how far they'll go, or how far they can get, I should say, and then they will just continue to poke those holes in those boundaries until they cross a line with the child. And once that line is crossed, that's when we might see some other things coming in, like some threats and some isolation. So whether it's a child who is at risk because mom is a single mom, or whether it's a confused child because they just don't feel like they have a place and this is the only person that understands them, they may, bring them to special places or take them to Fenway Park, and isn't that wonderful? I never get to go to Fenway Park and now I get to go. Or isn't it so great? I get to go to McDonald's Playhouse with this person. My mom never takes me there. Often this person is really helpful and friendly to have around, and you could think to yourself, oh my gosh, I don't know what I would have done without you. When there are those kinds of things happening, that is all part of that grooming process. And then it can kind of go into the last two bullets on this slide, which are then we begin to truly isolate that child, because now we're forcing them to keep a secret. We're forcing them to keep a secret that they can't tell anybody. And if they can't tell anybody their secret, if they do tell anybody their secret, then we're going to threaten them either with hurting their mom, or never taking them to Fenway Park again, or telling everybody they're a slut, or any other, fill in the blank threat that could be, life-threatening or life-altering for a child. And again, our May 7th workshop, we're going to be able to really dive into an activity that highlights that. It's one of those, that grooming process is one of the most, in my opinion, misunderstood parts of child abuse. We often think as adults that if a child ever experienced anything like this, they would immediately tell me, I'm their mom, I'm the person they tell everything to. If anything like this happened, they would tell me right away. And the reality is that that's not what happens. And it's incredibly confusing. It's incredibly manipulative. And it is absolutely not the child's fault. This person completely manipulates their role in the child's life to prey on them. And it can often become difficult even for that child as the relationship unfolds to tell, because maybe then they don't want to, they don't want to stop going to Fenway, and they really like that mom's not so stressed out anymore. And it's really okay that they have to deal with this thing. As long as they can keep those things in their life. That's how manipulative offenders can be. It's incredibly confusing. And that confusion often is the reason why so few children tell when they're a child, why only 1 in 10 children will disclose they're a victim of sexual abuse when they're a child. Often people wait until they're adults to tell, and if they even ever tell. Because it's incredibly hard to wrap your head around, even as an adult, to wrap one's head around what happened to them when they were a child. So how do we help, and what are some of those barriers that might exist to reporting? We have a child who is incredibly isolated, who may be sitting in our classroom, who has been kind of isolated, either maybe they were isolated before, maybe that was part of their vulnerability to a potential perpetrator of abuse, and so now they're isolated even further. And how do we help them? I mean, what can we do for them? What are some things that might be holding us back from stepping into that opportunity to help that child? It's really important that we kind of get into those because we need to understand them in order to kind of conquer them. Some of those barriers are just personal concerns. I'm afraid I don't really know how to do it, so I'm not going to bother. I don't really want to report on this family because I really like this family and I don't want to have an uncomfortable relationship with them. I'm kind of afraid if I'm wrong, they're going to sue me. I don't really have time. I have a super busy job. I have a busy family life. I don't have time to make this report and get involved in this way. And I have a trust with this family. I don't want to breach that trust. I might be afraid also that this might have consequences for my employment. I may have already called DCYF once and had a terrible experience and never knew what happened, and so I'm not going to bother doing that again. I'm afraid I might make it worse for the child. I'm afraid maybe mom or dad or whomever the alleged perpetrator is might come and come after me. Some of the after effects truly that can be, a worry are that I'm going to increase this child's risk, that this child's going to be ripped from their family and they're never going to be returned. The police are going to swoop in and they're going to take the child away, and it's all going to be my fault. And we're going to kind of talk about some other things here as well, as far as some of those barriers to really kind of getting to that place of picking up the phone and making that report. There are a lot of potential barriers. And I apologize, I really feel like I'm flying through all of this and like throwing information at you because we're on limited time here. So some of those things might be evidence issues. I can't see it, so I'm not going to report it. I don't really think it's, 100%, so I'm just going to kind of, I'm not going to, I don't know for sure that this happened, so I'm not going to report it. And you might even start kind of questioning what the child said. It's like, it can't possibly be true. And then, so those are some of those sort of evidence things. Like we kind of live in this CSI world, this sort of world of law and order, where these cases are kind of started and finished in 60 minutes. It's not how the real world works. That's not how we function in reality. Some of those system concerns might be, well, they're not going to do anything about it. I have no idea, I'm going to make my report and then I'm never going to hear another thing. Again, that kind of concern that the police and DCOF are going to swoop in and it's going to be nothing. Or they're going to swoop in and kind of take the child away and put them in foster care, and it's all going to be my fault. There's also, well, I'll talk about that later, sorry. As far as how do we respond? What do we do? How do we handle this if a child does come to me and says, if the child breaks down those barriers and comes to you directly and says, listen, I have to tell you something. This person has been coming into my room at night. This person has been touching me on the way to soccer practice. This person, makes me go out for ice cream with them, but on the way, they make me do something I don't like to do. This is just kind of a quick snapshot of how a child might decide to tell. And again, often it is an adult in their life that is not their parent. And when when we've done some parent presentations, that does not sit well with parents. Again, we have this idea as parents that our children will tell us anything, and that is not the reality of certainly in this case, that is not the reality when it is children who are dealing with sexual abuse. They often will go ahead and just test the waters. They'll tell you a little bit about what's going on, but they're not going to tell you everything. And they're doing that really to test you. They're doing that to test you to see, are you really the person that I should tell my whole story to, or are you someone who's going to disappoint me and not help me? Your reaction is incredibly important, and we're going to talk about that in a couple more slides. Depending, again, on your reaction, they may kind of test those waters, and then they may completely back away if your reaction is at all perceived by them to be negative or too emotional. And that is kind of why they don't tell their parents in a nutshell. They don't want to upset their parents. They don't want to make mom cry. They don't want to make mom angry. They don't want to make, put dad in jail because dad's going to physically assault this person. They want to tell someone else, someone who's going to go ahead and help them. Not that their parents won't, but they just don't want to upset them. So that adult response is also, again, no pressure, but incredibly important for moving forward for this child. Again, we can use the Larry Nasser case as a sort of modern day example of how many of those girls did in fact tell someone, whether it was a coach or a parent, and then the parent maybe didn't know exactly what to do with the information, and so didn't really handle it quite right. Know and Tell, our initiative aims to make sure that never happens again, to make sure that adults know exactly what to do with this information, and that's to report it to DCYF or law enforcement. There were, victim impact statement after victim impact statement about the long-term implications and effects that the abuse had for those girls. This is just a quick slide on something that we in the field call a tentative disclosure. And that really is a perfect example of children who are what, again, my words, called testing the waters, where if you are finding yourself in a situation and you may be, say they come to you at like the exact worst time, it's dismissal, it's the end of the day, you just want to go home because it's like Friday night and it's family movie night or barbecue or whatever. And they, come to you, and it might not be the exact right time. And so maybe at first you're a little bit like, what's going on? Huh? What? You're not quite paying attention 100%. Then you might start hearing some of these things like, well, it happened a long time ago, or it only happened once. Or so this is really just to completely encourage you to, if you find yourself in a situation where you feel like a child might be about to open up to you about something really important, to try to absolutely be 100% present, because that might be a missed opportunity. And I know we're all super busy, but it is one of those opportunities that might not come up again. And then how terrible would we feel if we found out later on that was maybe the child's first attempt at getting help. Some things to say are, I believe you, and that you're glad that you know about it. It's 100% okay to be upset, but to really try to not show that. And if it is coming out just because it's so upsetting, to acknowledge it, but just acknowledge that you're not upset with them. Children are incredibly, this is going to sound terrible, but incredibly self-centered. They really think that adult emotions are because of them. And so it's important that they understand that it's not anything they did or that's the reason you're upset. It's because of what the other person did. And that nothing that they did made this happen. It's really important that kiddos know that you believe them and that you're gonna help them get help. This is one of those instances where a child has 100% picked you as the person to share their secret with. And it is a responsibility. They didn't pick you by accident. They picked you because they thought you would help them. They picked you because they had been either watching you or observing you in some way interact with either them or other children, and they've decided that you're a person they can count on. And so they want you to help them, even though they may follow up their disclosure or their outcry with, it happened a really long time ago, or I'm not really sure I'm remembering it correctly, or I don't really know that, please don't tell anybody. I have a secret, but please don't tell anybody my secret. Oftentimes they are very much aware that you have to tell their secret, that you, even though it happened a really long time ago, that you're still, mandated to report what happened. It's important also to know that it is absolutely a process, that it's a process, not an event. And that just by them coming to you and saying, this person's been coming into my room late at night, I don't know what to do about it, that is enough information to go ahead and call DCYF. You don't have to ask questions about like who, what, where, or when. Those are questions that get asked at the Child Advocacy Center. Those are questions that get asked by the investigative team. This is just a quick slide about how oftentimes children will test those waters, but then they'll completely say, no, 72% in one study that then said, no, it didn't really happen, denied it later on. And that's because they're absolutely terrified of what's coming next. They're completely afraid of the unknown, which is what's going to happen next. All those unknowns, whether it's mom's boyfriend is the perpetrator or the soccer coach or whatever it was. And again, you can look to the gymnastics case as a kind of textbook example of this. I kind of already highlighted this. When a child discloses, when and if a child discloses to you that it's not your job to interview the child. It's important also that you know in your school, if you have a school policy regarding mandated reporting, if the school policy says that you need to conduct an interview of that child, that school policy is incorrect. It is not the school's job to interview children who have disclosed abuse or are suspected of being abused. It is the school's job, or the person who has handled or who has heard the disclosure of abuse. It's their job to listen 100% to the disclosure. Of course, you have to assess for immediate danger. Again, if it's a Friday afternoon and it's 3:30 and it's dismissal time and the child is saying they don't want to go home because when they get home, so-and-so is going to be there and so-and-so always does X, Y, and Z to them, that's a different story. You, of course, would need to immediately call law enforcement in that regard, or in DCYF to make sure that the child's safety is taken care of. But it is not, we have heard oftentimes in our Child Advocacy Center from children who say that they had to then go to the guidance counselor's office, and then they had to go to the principal's office, and all these people ask them questions. What's happened in that situation is now every single person that has talked to that child has made themselves a witness in a potential criminal prosecution. And all that needed to happen was that that first person that heard the outcry of abuse needed to call DCYF and make that report. Of course, then we can go through our, in school policies about making sure the appropriate people know that the report was made. But if people have questions about that, I'm happy to answer any of those questions either offline or at the end. So this is just again, if you are a person who a child is coming to you to disclose, you need to try to find a quiet space. You need to be 100% honest with them if they're asking questions about what's going to happen next that you might not know the answer. It's really super important to use the child's language, not to correct them. If they use a word like hoo-ha or choo-cha or some ridiculous word that doesn't make any sense to you, you can maybe ask a clarifying question, but please don't, replace your word or, the scientific word or the biological word with that. And again, because in a forensic interview, it's the forensic interviewer's job to really clarify what that body part is. And that's for legal purposes, for a potential prosecution in this case. I'm going to zip through all of this stuff because we're running out of time. It's super important not to, promise to keep that secret. Try not to make any promises that you're going to, protect them or make sure this never happens again. We just can't make promises that we're not going to be able to keep. It's also really important if a child's disclosing to you not to ask any why questions, like why didn't you tell anybody before, or why did you keep going over to their house, or why did you keep going to soccer practice? Why questions really don't have any place in this kind of conversation. And it's also really important to, if a child is disclosing to you about a perpetrator or something that happened to them, not to talk badly about that perpetrator. Again, we talked about the grooming process and the relationship that develops. This child will often feel very conflicted about sharing with you, and so they might also even like the person, even though they've been doing those things to them. So it's important not to call them names or anything like that. This is just a quick slide for all of us who have children that we care about in our life, and we can hopefully get going early and often with teaching children proper names for those body parts, because if they use those funky words like hoo-ha and choo-cha, that we again in that forensic interview don't have to establish what that is, that we will just be able to know exactly what that body part is because the child will be using the proper body part. This is that word secrets is just not an okay word. Surprises are okay, but secrets are just a part of when we talk to kids, it's really better to even not use that word at all. When we're talking to kids just in terms of life, that we have surprises are okay, secrets are typically not okay. I'm going to flip through that because we got to get to the part that's super important as far as mandated reporting policies. This is the actual RSA. It's an RSA 169C. This is very boring as far as the legal mumbo jumbo, but you can see there the words are right there. Any person has reason to suspect a child under the age of 18 has been abused must make a report. That is not murky language. That is not unclear. That is not, it does not say any person must investigate. It says any person that has reason to suspect must make a report. And it's important to know that a report is not an accusation. You are not, you do not have to have you don't have to have evidence, whether it's, you don't have to see it with your own eyes, but you have to, a reasonable suspicion is absolutely enough. It's really when you're picking up that phone and calling DCYF, or you're making a request that they look into it. And here's here is the phone number. And if this is one of those things where it's the weekend, or you could please feel free, don't hesitate to call local law enforcement. What will happen is DCYF it'll go to central intake. It may or may not get assigned a district office. It may or may not get opened for assessment. If it gets open for assessment, we will often get involved at that point in time. The Child Advocacy Center will receive a referral. These are just children that we see at Child Advocacy Centers. This is what is called a multidisciplinary team. These are people who are then tasked to essentially surround that child with investigative and supportive roles. Again, none of these people get involved unless a report is made to DCYF or law enforcement. We don't see children at this Child Advocacy Center unless people report child abuse or suspected child abuse. You can see here that reports are made. They refer here to the CAC either with a phone call, an email, or a fax, and then we are able to coordinate with all of the investigative partners and supportive partners to schedule that interview. The child comes in for one interview. The Child Advocacy Center is a developmentally appropriate place where the family and the children can receive as much information as possible about next steps in moving forward. Again, often a crime has occurred. Child abuse and child sexual abuse is a crime, and so we need to get as much information as we possibly can. And it's important that all of those investigative partners are at the table, because DCYF wears, their home safety hat, and the law enforcement officers wear their investigative. I need to find out if other crimes were committed. I need to know who else I need to talk to. The family is greeted when they come, but the crisis center advocate, we partner with our crisis centers very, very much, and they are given a tour of the center. We have to get permission in order to interview the child. In a forensic interview, forensic essentially means fact-finding. Questions are open-ended, they're non-leading, they're fact-finding, and they're victim-centered. I encourage anyone also, we are able to do tours of child advocacy centers. Just go ahead and contact us for any information about requesting that. Caregivers are not allowed to observe the interview. The interview is recorded and it is considered evidence. DCYF and law enforcement leave with a copy. Caregivers are not allowed to observe the interview in any way because it will essentially make them a witness. But when the family leaves, they leave after what we call the post-interview meeting, where they are given, a conversation is had about what was disclosed in the interview, what next steps are, and what's gonna be around the corner for that family. This is a photograph of one of the waiting rooms of one of the child advocacy centers in New Hampshire. As you can see, this one is very much child-friendly. I can't imagine a teenager would be super excited to be in this space, but we do interview, again, children ages 2 to 18, and some child advocacy centers are interviewing adults as requested by law enforcement. Some child advocacy centers also are having sort of a dual waiting room where they have a adolescent waiting room and a child waiting room. This is a picture of the observation room, so the MDT partners would be around the table, and that you can see the picture of the interview room on the other side. There would be people, the interviewer and the child in those chairs. And this is where the conversation occurs between the child and the forensic interviewer. That is our presentation in a nutshell, an absolute blow through of what we will be doing a more in-depth presentation of on May 7th. That's from 9 until 11:30. Again, we'll have some activities to highlight some of the more dynamic elements of child sexual abuse and child abuse in general. But I open it up to questions, and we have an evaluation process as well. We're going to be sending out a Survey Monkey probably tomorrow with feedback. So questions?
Okay, well, it doesn't sound like we have any questions. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon and thank Megan and Stephanie for your hard work in bringing this information. Please be on the lookout for registration for that in-person training on May 7th. That should be coming out in the next week or two. And you can see here on the slide contact information for both Megan and Stephanie, as well as their website, and I will share that out as well. Any last thoughts, Megan?
No, not at all. I would just encourage anybody with any lingering questions or to certainly reach out via email or by telephone. We're always available to answer questions. This is a very delicate topic and can often bring up a lot of questions either after the fact or in a couple days. So please don't ever hesitate to reach out.
Great. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thanks, Kelly. You too. Bye-bye.